do a welcome and a hello. So nice to have everyone here who's here. Um, so the final phrase of the passage we're going to look as we're now moving into Matthew 20. The final phrase, verse today, is a phrase that Jesus repeats a couple of different occasions in the gospel. The many are called, and I've kind of we tend to say it as many are called, a few are chosen. I probably touched on this before, trying to remember all the things we've covered and whether we've covered Jesus saying this before. But the word that we translate as chosen isn't. It's not a great translation, which means that we sometimes don't fully understand what it is that Jesus is saying in the mix. As a general rule, I think. Although it's a bit of a paraphrase, many are called, few live up to the opportunities. Perhaps driving at what Jesus is saying is that there are people who are called, and that's great, but actually their behaviour or their faith approach to that calling doesn't necessarily demonstrate the value of the calling. So I know I'm getting to the last verse and we haven't even got there. And that's and you can see that from the way that the Greek word klektos is used in the Septuagint, the version of the Old Testament, because there you can see it translating various Hebrew words. So it's much more to do with the quality rather than the fact that you have been chosen by someone. So when we use the word chosen, we imagine somebody looking at you and going, "I want you." You see, so. And that for some people that kind of relates to God's election, but I don't think that's really what the verse is about, because the Hebrew and even the Greek is more to do with having the kind of quality that gets you chosen. So there are many are called, but few have got the quality that means that they really look like they should have been called or chosen, if that makes sense. Now I'm kind of doing that up front because, as we're going to see in this context, when Matthew uses it in relation to this parable, it has a kind of slightly more focused. It's still within that framework, but the meaning is more focused, and we'll kind of get to that at the end. So if we kind of run through the actual text, so we're just kind of flowing on from Matthew 19. Of course, says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man." I put like to. That sounds very formal and religious, doesn't it? I like to a man, but it's like a man. His kingdom of heaven is similar to a who's the master of a house, and he went out around daybreak to hire workers for his vineyard. So we're kind of coming into a formula that Jesus uses quite often when in his parables, and so we have various of these parables which are about people receiving a sense of reward. So, but they're all slightly different. Two of them are more similar than this one, but I think that I would include this as a kind of a third version of a similar theme, where people have some sort of responsibility to do something. They do something, they get a reward. So the first parable that we think of like that is the parable of the talents, where one person gets 10 talents, 1 5, and 1 talent, and they do different things with those things. Then there's a second parable that's like it, where 3 servants get the same amount. I can't remember what the amount is given there, but the amount is kind of a more normal amount. The talents are an enormous amount. It's like having billions of pounds. And then there's this one where they're getting a small amount. And this one is slightly different, as we're going to see, but all three of them are slightly different. But I think part of the reason why Jesus often talks in parables that have money and reward in them is because actually money and reward ideas, fair return for my work, how have those things gone, they actually kind of are wired into our emotional centres. Is one of those interesting things. That if you had a spare fMRI scanner at home and you put your head into the fMRI scanner and you started to think about money, you will find that it's the emotional parts of your brain that are being activated. Whereas if you talk about mathematics, can you add 5 and 3 together? It goes through logical parts of the brain. But if I say, can you add £5 to £3, just adding the word pounds, suddenly it goes through an emotional part of the brain. Now, why? Obviously, as Jesus' listeners didn't know that, but they would have known the impact, which is when you start to put those things, you start to have a more emotional rather than purely logical response to things. And I think that's deliberate in the way Jesus tells stories. But equally, sometimes it's not reflected when we try and explain a parable, because we try and describe it all logically, you see. But actually, for the hearers, they would have an emotional response to this process. So we're going to see as we go through how this looks like. So actually, what I should have done, I'm just going to throw a quick prayer up now, because I like to start with prayer. It helps me get my brain in gear and connected to heaven. So Father, just pray you'll anoint what we look at today and make it useful to us in Jesus' name. So anyway, so the guy's gone out. He goes out first thing in the morning. And if you think about it, therefore, the people who are waiting in the marketplace are really proactive. They're taking responsibility for their lives. They're getting on with things. They are those who kind of would kind of have one of those signs up in their house that say, God helps those who help themselves. It's not that that's necessarily a terribly wrong thing, but it's not biblical. But they would live by that kind of mantra. They've got there early. They're going to be there, and they're very sensible people to have around. You'll do far better with a team of folks who think like that, who get ahead of the game, get there into the moment. So he agrees with them. So he talks to them. So what do you need? And a denarius is about a day's wage. So they agree a kind of standard day's wage. I think there's nothing more to it than that. It's a fair wage. And so he goes to send them off to their vineyard to do a day's work for a fair wage. But going out and about the third hour, so kind of between 8 and 9 o'clock, he saw others standing around in the marketplace. So they're standing around, and he said to them, and the whole context of standing around is they're in the marketplace, but they haven't got stuff to sell. They're there to try and sell themselves. They are looking for work. So they're there a bit later. It would have been easy to take kind of a judgmental view to say, well, do you know what? It's the early bird who gets the worm. Those guys already got there. But actually, he's generous and says to them, I'll give you whatever is fair. You go and work now. And at the end of the day, I'll give you whatever is fair. There's already people who've kind of gone on the standard rate, pro rata, you can expect it. It's kind of the logic. So off they go. You can see why I'm thinking we'll be quicker, because quite quick to run through the parable. So then he goes out again, the 6th hour. So now we're halfway through the working day. And then at the 9th hour, so now we're 3/4 of the way through the working day. But he does the same. So he keeps on drawing folks in. Then around the 11th hour, so now we've only got an hour of work left to go. He goes out, finds others standing around and said, why do you stand there all day inactive? And they said to him, because no one has hired us. And he told them, you also go into the vineyard and you'll get whatever is fair. So, of course, because almost everyone who comes to these live events are pretty au fait with reading the Bible. You know these stories well. So I do apologize. I'm kind of getting the whole thing together before we kind of reflect on the parable. And then when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, starting with the last and moving on to the first. So when those from about the 11th hour came, they each received a full day's wage. They received the denarius. And so if you imagine that the story as the original hearers heard it, and not listening to it with the kind of religious, abstracted logic that we might bring to the story, but listening to it with kind of emotional interest, you have this kind of interesting dynamic going on. So you have an employer, and he's turning up, and he seems like a good employer, because even though he's got an initial wave of workers, even those who are a bit later, he's still treating them graciously. He's offering them work, giving them a place to go. So there is a wonderful kind of expression of because we don't know the reason why workers get there later in the day, but let's think kindly about why they're a bit later. There is what's in modern political terms, because what I was going to say is this parable has an incredible amount to say because it's so incredibly current, and you hear it being debated and discussed and pushed. Some of the dynamics that go on in this on both sides of the political spectrum. So in this early phase, we're hearing kind of an employer who's giving what they refer to as equity of opportunity. So even though someone's turned up later, we're still going to give them the same opportunity. You can still go and do this. You can still go and do that. And equity of opportunity is a really important godly spiritual principle, if I think of it like that. It also, for some strange reason, I don't know why the things fall one way or the other, it tends to be the focus of those who lean more to the right politically. So you'll often find that there's this balance in this parable, you see, of two types of equity, two types of fairness. And fairness is one of those things that seems to be very emotionally hardwired into us. You know, you see it when children are playing on, you come in and get a piece of cake and one kid grabs the big piece of cake, the outrage caused by that's not fair. So fairness is this kind of very fuzzy concept, but it creates a big emotional reaction in us. And some people are wired in a way where they notice unfairness of opportunity, which actually here we're having a fairness of opportunity. Even though you're late to the game, even though you weren't up with the dawn, let's assume that you had all sorts of responsibilities, 5 kids to get to school, a sick mother, etc., etc. So you get there a bit later, and you get there at lunchtime. Well, why couldn't you be there in the morning? Well, who knows what responsibilities you had? We don't know, but we're not going to take away opportunities from you. We want to be fair. We'll give you those things. But now those, yeah, so anyway, they're working back the payment, as we know, from last to first. So when it came to the first, now those who got there early, those who were on the ball, those who did make the most of the opportunity that was there and tried to kind of live by taking responsibility for their own time and so on, they all received the same, which of course they had agreed to. But now the response of those workers is a very, as I say, very real one. So they start grumbling against the master of the house, saying, the last, i.e. those lasters, as we might think of them, they've just worked 1 hour and you've made them equal to us who carried the weight of the day and the scorching heat. So now suddenly what we're seeing is there was a complaint. We're happy because now this is what we refer to as equity of outcome. And there's often a clash between these two types of fairness. And you find that, so those who lean more to the left politically are often looking for inequities of outcome. So whereas those who lean more to the right are looking for inequities or equities of opportunity. And the two kind of get very loggerheaded, and actually we find the same dynamic going on. And I think it's kind of worth speaking into a little bit in that broad sense, because it's still very, very current. It's an unfair world where if only the wealthy can go and get a good education. You see, nothing I can do in terms of the circumstances I had. So we try as a society to create an equality of access to opportunity. So we want to try and do that. But equally, some of those who have had that and get into that, we then feel it's very unfair when people who don't do anything at all seem to get the same outcomes as we do. You see, and that's the equity of outcome. And as you kind of, I should, if I was better perhaps prepared today, I could have given you loads of verses from the Old Testament. My reading of the Bible is you find a bias in terms of weight towards the sense that the foundational form of fairness is about giving people equal opportunity, if I can put it that way. But there are occasions, and sometimes what we think of as equity of outcome, it actually can feel unfair. In other words, somebody didn't do any work like these guys. They've only been there for an hour and they're getting paid the same. And that really does wind us up. We do get wound up when I think there's kind of a famous little anecdote. I think it's in one of Martin Gladwell's books. Which one was it? But anyway, where he talks about the guy who got fired for the US Stock Exchange. He was fired because he basically made the stock exchange too efficient and made too much money, and people resented how much money he had made from the stock exchange. So it's not fair that you had that opportunity, nobody else had it, and so on. and on the same day, a piece of research was first published, which we all know about now, which is the way in which capuchin monkeys withdraw from engagement with activity that they benefit from if they see one monkey getting rewarded with a grape and everybody else is getting a piece of cucumber. And the kind of the two things were recognized as being actually very similar. that people who didn't use the New York Stock Exchange at all looked at the report on how much money he had made and thought, that's not fair that somebody should have that opportunity. so we wanted to punish them, you see, in the same way that the capuchin monkeys, we're looking at, if I do these activities, I get rewarded with a piece of cucumber, really happy until there's one monkey that starts getting a piece of grape. And then something in them feels, oh, that's not fair at all. And it's a very emotional response. I always want us to not miss the fact that when Jesus spoke in parables, he always told stories that for his original hearers would have generated a whole range of emotions in them. We don't hear them that way because we've learnt to read them as religious texts. And it's interesting, I used to do school's work. If you ask a child to start reading something in the Bible, they would, even the smartest Alec kid who kind of is playing up the whole way, you ask them to read something from the Bible and they kind of put on a strange voice and start we kind of almost engage with words of scripture in a slightly abstracted, reverential, formal way, and instead of engaging them and hearing something that you think that would wind me up. and perhaps what I'm trying to kind of get across here is I can imagine a whole range of different types of people who could get wound up by this story. On the whole, the people who are mainly going to get wound up, but we'll see it's not perhaps universal, will be those who looked at the story and say there was an inequity of outcome. There was lovely that there was equity of opportunity, but actually, if you work 3 times as long, you should get paid 3 times as much. So that's the inequity there. But equally. Oh, we'll leave it. Hang on. Yeah, I'm kind of rambling a bit. I do apologise. Just want to get my head around Okay. So the parable itself seems to be addressed in many ways, though, to those who are believers. In the sense that the disciples that are immediately around Jesus are those who have come into a relationship with the Lord early on. And you see this sort of dynamic a little bit in church, whereby they're early adopters, which means they often have toiled and done heavy lifting, heavy work, but equally they have built up some wisdom and some understanding, and they see things with clarity. And they know they've managed how to organize their faith in such a way that they can live fruitful, productive lives. And then we tend to celebrate, isn't it fantastic when somebody who comes from a really broken background comes in at the last hour, and that's a wonderful victory for the kingdom. But you only have to give it a little bit of time, and suddenly the person who's got the great testimony because they came in late in the day, suddenly it's a very real impact I've seen happen time and time again in church. Those who have been around for a bit longer start to get a little bit offended by the fact that they it now seems to be that they have unfair status. And I want to be very cautious because I'm quoting a real person. But I remember talking to someone who is very, very competent in their Christian faith. They've been a Christian since they were in their early teens. They're a really good worship leader, really good teacher, lots of ways. And I remember talking to them once because they seemed really down and really frustrated and quite annoyed with stuff. And they actually threw out this phrase with they actually referred to another person who they referred to just spiritually all over the place, a total fruitcake, something along those lines they used. And they seem to get more opportunity and people listen to them more than they do to me. You see. Now, it's easy when I say that to kind of say, well, I want to be judgmental against that person. But I think it's the dynamic that we have going on here that perhaps Jesus is trying to draw across. The more you walk with Jesus, it is 100% true that there is a kind of a sense in which, at a human way of looking at things, you ought to be earning some respect, and from that peer-to-peer level, you kind of feel like, well, my opinion should matter more, and perhaps the reason why I'm finding it struggle to kind of deal with it is because I think it does. I think that's someone who's been reading the Bible for 10 years and studying it while so on doesn't mean that they're always right, but we should try and hear them, and give greater weight very often to the person who's just a new Christian who's got some wonderful experiences and so on. But the thing I think that is complicated, which is why I think Jesus tells the story as we kind of go on, is it's not always that biblical principles are all black and all white. They are often, this seems to be the way, the principle, it works 90% of the time, but it gets out of balance unless you have 10% of the other principle. So it's not that things are in contradiction, but they often hold things in tension, if that makes sense. And I think here's a really good example. Why I say I think as I read Scripture, I think that the emphasis is on a justice or a fairness of opportunity, that we are all born as children under God, and some of us, for whatever reason, we get born into with the ability to take opportunities that others don't. So I was born in the United Kingdom, and as a result, I have had a free education right the way through even university, because I was born before 19, whenever it was, when they changed the rules. So I've benefited that in the kingdom of God, everybody should be born in a place where they perhaps had the opportunity of free education, you see. So there's kind of something unjust there, and we try and balance it out, and we try and get it into place. We want to give people that equality of opportunity, give them the chance to do the things they wouldn't be able to do. And that seems to be the majority. And then within that context, if everybody has got that equality of opportunity, then it ought to be fair that on the whole, someone gets paid if they put in more effort than somebody else. But I have to be reminded emotionally, because I tend to think that way, you see. I think so if someone does twice the work, you should give them twice the amount. Is that sometimes actually the inequality of opportunity actually hampers somebody from being able to do as much as I can. So you just think about, say, your reading speed. See that benefit you had of opportunity early on means that now when you look at outcome, it's easy for me to kind of add up 100 numbers in so many seconds, whereas it takes somebody else twice as long. So do I pay them half the amount? So all these questions. What I'm hoping to get across is you put yourself in those emotional contexts. How do we respond? Sorry, yeah. So what I wanted to try and get across very often is it's not an either or, because both are important, but they're not necessarily equal. So it's often that we have to kind of modify our understanding of one thing via another. And I think therefore, if you like, our expectations of what somebody is going to produce within the kingdom will rely both on not just the opportunity they have to do something, but even to the point of where they got to in their ability to do it when they're there. So if for whatever reason, if for instance I have slightly lame leg and I'm late every morning. So most of the time I don't get an opportunity to go and work because I'm just there a bit too late because I didn't have that equality of opportunity. So when I do get the opportunity, I will often not do as well with it as somebody who's had lots of opportunity. See? And the challenge really that Jesus has in the mix, and it's different because the denarius is a day's living wage. It's not a kind of a huge reward. It's just about you've got the basics in place. And would you resent folks for not having those basics in place because God is generous with them? So he just keep going. But answering him, he said, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. You didn't agree with me. Didn't you agree with me for a denarius?" In other words, you've got your fair reward for the fair day. Take what's yours, move on. See, I want to give to this laster, likewise to you. So one of those who turned up at the last minute, who turned up with less to contribute to the mix, but I want to be generous to them. Is it not okay for me to do what I want with what I own, or is your eye evil because I am good? We've touched on this before as we've gone through the concept of the evil eye, which is mean-spirited. It's not generous. And Jesus is kind of, in this story, he is throwing in a challenge, which is almost the opposite of some of the earlier parables I talked about. So in the parable of the talents, we've got people with millions and millions of pounds to trade with. And someone with millions and millions complains that somebody else has got more than they have. I couldn't do as much because I only had 1 million and they had 5 million. You see, whereas on this occasion, it's kind of almost the injury is the other way around, which is we're all trying to survive. We all need to get daily work. I work hard to make sure I'm there to get the opportunity I get, and yet somehow God's compassion means that daily supply, that daily blessing, is equally available to those who come in and don't seem to make the same opportunity that I did. And I have to kind of balance those things. And I think, but answering one of them, so one of these people who's making that complaint says, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong, didn't?" We've already gone through that because I'm good. And so the last will be first and the first last. For many are called, but few are choice. I put that in little triangular brackets because it's not in every ancient manuscript, but I think it is a good illustration of this phrase that Jesus uses. Because you've got two sides to which the story Jesus has told. There are people who fail to be totally choice. For many are called, so he was there at break of dawn, he's there at 9 o'clock, he's there at 6 o'clock, he's there at dawn, he's there at 3 hours afterwards, so 8 to 9, another 3 hours later around 12, in the middle of the afternoon, right the way through. Loads of people are getting called here, but few are choice. Few have that real marker, as if to say you really stand out. And you can see this in both directions within the parable, because those who were there right at the beginning, who made the most of their opportunity, which at one level you say, excellent choice, they've got the mettle, they have what it takes to have been called and to be chosen. But now at the end of the day, they're complaining about what they've got, even though they were happy with when they signed up for it. And so it's kind of almost they have undermined their own sense by their mean-spiritedness about those who've come in late. So they're not too choice. And those on the other end, that it speaks more to God's grace and more to God's goodness, the fact that he's able to be generous with them. But they themselves are people who, for various reasons, some good, some bad, and some just habits and things that they've learnt, have learnt sometimes not to turn up until the middle of the afternoon to see if they can get a day's worth of work that way. So they're not necessarily top quality choice either. And I think therefore when you balance all of that mix in, you realise in this parable, which has an emotional response in Jesus' listeners, he's challenging them that for a whole umpteen different reasons, God's generosity is he wants to call everyone. That he dies for the sins of the world. as disciples of Jesus, and I put this now in the mix of even those who are now walking in that calling, we're walking in that calling. Actually, we can all have in our different ways, different attitudes that show we're not really expressing the kind of behavior that will be the reason you got chosen. So if I go back, I think I can remember which psalm it's in, is the word choice is used there when it talks about the choice arrow. It's the arrow that's got the quality, it's got such high quality that it's always the one you pull out to use, you see. And what Jesus is driving at is there's a whole host of us coming into the mix. A lot of unworthy people have got called, and that includes me, even though it seems to me that I think to myself, hey, but I got there early. You know, I became a Christian when I was 16. I put in the time. I've done the heavy labour. I've got kind of laughed at by my school friends, but I didn't get beaten up, so that's a win. I've gone through those things. So now I've got some things, and I stand up front on church, and I can do those things. But now here's a new person who didn't have those same opportunities early on in life. And so we're really pleased, though. We're delighted. We cheer the fact that God gives them equal opportunity. But then when they seem to do as well as we do, then we say, well, that's not equality. That's unfairness of outcome. So actually it produces those less than quality responses in me, in my heart. And I think I won't keep on going on forever and ever on this theme, because I think hopefully you got what I'm driving at. Is that in telling of this parable and this phrase which Jesus uses several times, the last will be first and the first last, is that actually we need to be regularly, as we're being called into the purposes and kingdom of God, confronting the fact that we will find certain things emotionally challenging, not just intellectually challenging, but emotionally challenging, because the generosity of God in the way he deals with people and the way he means that actually there will be times where it will feel unfair. Whichever side of the spectrum you sit on, whether you're one of those who turned up late because you had all sorts of valid reasons why life has left you where you're at, or whether they're one of those who turned up early and made the most of the opportunities, there will always be those things that we can choose to feel unfair and creates a problem between us and the Lord. And the challenge, I think, and the reason why Jesus tells the story is he wants to kind of coach those things out of his followers to be able to celebrate with everybody's success, including my own, not just my own, even when sometimes I think, well, I had to work really hard on this. Why do I find it so difficult? That person hardly did a thing and they got the same thing. So anyway, I will wind it up there, because and really kind of hand it over to the questions, see if anyone would like to draw anything out of that.